Hello, and thank you for taking time to listen to my presentation of the following topic, Gender Depression and its Intersection with Discrimination Based on Race, by Jenna Shakian-Brocchini. Consider the following definitions from threshold concepts before we begin. Intersectionality is defined as a theoretical framework that posits the multiple social categories, for example, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, intersects at the micro level of individual experience to reflect multiple interlocking systems of privilege and oppression at the macro social structural level, for example, racism, sexism, heterosexism, compulsory heterosexuality, heteronormativity, and ableism. Oppression is when there is prejudice and discrimination toward a group. Gender depression is based on gender norms in society and is a mechanism that benefits masculinity as opposite genders are an inadequate binary pair in which femininity is subsidiary to masculinity. Gendered racism is a form of oppression that occurs due to race and gender. Stereotypes of minority women contribute to their victimization. Examples of this include Latino women are stereotypically feisty and exotic. Asian women are depicted as obedient and passive. African American women are portrayed as mammy figures, promiscuous, and unmarried. The examination of gender depression and its intersection with discrimination based on race has a great deal of history and evokes various issues which will be discussed in this presentation, along with some possible solutions or steps needed to deal with such a complex, multifaceted problem. Why is this an issue, and who is affected? The intersection of gender and racial oppression is an issue for women of color in all facets of society, socially, politically, and economically. Women of color face dual oppression as both women operating in a patriarchal society and minorities struggling for relevance within a white power structure. To better understand this issue, we must first place it within its historical context. These are the historical topics we will focus on to exhibit intersectionality in its early stages. Threshold Concepts points out early models of intersectional analysis of race and gender have been offered by African American women writers dating back to the 19th century. The authors use Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech to demonstrate the intersectionality of racism and sexism. Truth aimed to critique were assumptions about womanhood and femininity, and what her speech gets at is the ways that in the mid-19th century, as in contemporary society, womanhood has no single monolithic definition. Race, class, sexuality, and other identities are profound influences on an individual woman's experience, but that all of these rich identities are equally valid forms of womanhood. Congress did not extend the political rights of citizenship to black males until it adopted the 15th Amendment in 1870. Until this development, advocates of women's rights in the 19th century considered black males' legal status to be equal to their own, that of second-class citizens, citizens with small civil but no political rights. The women's movement led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began as a counterpart to and an ally of the abolition movement. However, when Congress amended the Constitution to forbid discrimination in voting on the basis of race, but not on the basis of gender, the alliance abruptly ended. It is interesting to consider this gender depression in history, as it took 50 years after suffrage was extended to black men for women to become enfranchised. The history of this discrimination is important in our understanding of today's oppression of women, specifically women of color. A current issue women face are wage gaps and economic disadvantages. For women of color, the described reasons that contribute to wage gap are habitually different than those of white women, since women of color frequently work in lower paying jobs, work fewer hours, and experience more substantial caregiving burdens. According to a 2016 Pew Research poll, white and Asian women have narrowed the wage gap with white men to a much greater degree than black and Hispanic women. For example, white women narrowed the wage gap in median hourly earnings by 22 cents from 1980, when they earned on average 60 cents for every dollar earned by a white man, to 2015 when they earned 82 cents. By comparison, black women only narrowed that gap by 9 cents, from earnings 56 cents for every dollar earned by a white man in 1980 to 65 cents today. Asian women followed roughly the trajectory of white women, but earned slightly higher 87 cents per dollar earned by a white man in 2015, whereas Hispanic women fared even worse than black women, narrowing the gap by just 5 cents, earning 58 cents on the dollar in 2015. It is averaged that women lose out on more than $400,000 over the course of their careers, but most women of color are shorted more than double that, which is an outrageous statistic. What are potential solutions to help solve this problem? Ideas for change. Raise the minimum wage. Women make up a disproportionate share of low-wage workers, so raising the minimum wage could make a huge difference, especially those who are mothers and are minorities. Raise the tipped minimum wage. According to the Economic Policy Institute, women make up 2/3 of tipped workers, and currently the federal tipped minimum wage only pays workers $2.13 per hour. Raising this wage could make a huge difference in decreasing the wage gap. Support fair scheduling practices. When women of color are more likely to work in low-wage jobs and often have unpredictable schedules that can change at any time, which is difficult for working mothers as far as childcare is concerned. With a lack of flexibility, many mothers can lose their jobs because of these scheduling practices. Support pay transparency. Since women cannot discuss their salaries with colleagues, there is no way of knowing if they are making less than their male colleagues for doing the same job. If there was no pay secrecy, women could address pay discrimination, which would help combat the gender wage gap. Invest in affordable, high-quality childcare. Better childcare would give mothers the ability to keep a job, excel in the workplace, and help lower the gender wage gap in doing so. And finally, pass paid sick days legislation. This type of legislation would allow mothers to be home with their sick children instead of the concern of losing their jobs and income. While the issues of gender wage gap requires much needed change and progress, a more immediate issue that needs to be addressed is violence and sexual violence against women of color, which is the worst form of oppression for this group. Threshold Concept states in the United States approximately 22% of black women and 14.6% of Hispanic women have experienced rape at some point in their lives. Upon further research, more startling statistics emerge. American Indians are the victims of rape and sexual assault at a rate that is 3.5 times higher than any other race in the United States. Almost 7.9% of Latinas will be raped by a spouse, partner, or ex-partner during their lifetime. Approximately 40% of black women report forced sexual contact by age 18. Nearly 33.5% of women who identified as multiracial report rape victimization in their lifetime. Black women experience intimate partner violence at rates 35% higher than white women. These figures exemplify just how susceptible communities of color are to sexual assault and rape, and that much of it goes unreported. For every African American woman who reports her rape, at least 15 African American women do not report theirs. Threshold Concepts discusses a 2014 research study reported on the normalization of sexual violence among girls and women, and concluded that many young women view sexual violence and accompanying behaviors such as objectification, abuse, and harassment by boys and men as a normal part of daily life. This type of barrier for women can be classified as rape culture, and according to Lynn Phillips, a lecturer in communication at UMass Amherst, rape culture is a culture in which dominant cultural ideologies, media images, social practices, and societal institutions support and condone sexual abuse by normalizing, trivializing, and eroticizing male violence against women and blaming victims for their own abuse. There are other rape culture barriers that emerge. Only 27% whose assault met the legal definition of rape consider themselves rape victims. 1 in 3 of men would rape if they knew they'd get away with it. 1 in 16 men are rapists. Additional factors that cause women to not report these heinous acts include religious beliefs, religious convictions, and a fear of shame or rejection from their church, loyalty to their race, culture, and family, distrust of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and their legal status in the United States. The fear of reporting these crimes are why perpetrators prey on this group in the first place. Let's take a moment to watch Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk, The Urgency of Intersectionality. In this moving talk, she calls on us to bear witness to this reality and speak up for victims of prejudice.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm going to name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're going to see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you can be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job, and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans, and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So, what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them do not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the back seat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers? It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront, the everyday violence and humiliation that many Black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness to some of this violence. We're going to hear the voice of the phenomenal Abby Dobson. And as we sit with these women, some who've experienced violence and some who have not survived them, we have an opportunity to reverse what happened at the beginning of this talk, when we could not stand for these women because we did not know their names. So at the end of this clip, there's going to be a roll call. Several Black women's names will come up. I'd like those of you who are able to join us in saying these names as loud as you can, randomly, disorderly. Let's create a cacophony of sound to represent our intention to hold these women up, to sit with them, to bear witness to them, to bring them into the light.
Say her name. Say her name. Oh, say her name. Say her name. Say their names, for all the names I'll never know.
I asked Sharon Jones, Janisa Fonville, Catherine Johnson, Kayla Moore, Michelle Cassell, Rakia Boyd, Shelley Frey, Tarika Yvette Smith.
Say their name.
So I said at the beginning, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. Together, we've come together to bear witness to these women's lost lives. But the time now is to move from mourning and grief to action and transformation. This is something that we can do. It's up to us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
This next video is an extension of Dr. Crenshaw's discussion and movement, which you may watch if you choose, but please do so at your own discretion. After watching Crenshaw's talk, thought-provoking questions are: what institutional and societal structures or practices should be improved or implemented to provide security and opportunity to marginalized groups? What can a person with privilege or positions of power do to support these victims in a meaningful way? What are other specific identities that intersect to make people vulnerable to violent situations such as these? It is significant to know some of the history involved in gendered racial oppression, for historically, when we discuss civil rights being extended to blacks and the progression of societal attention to issues of black oppression, usually the conversation revolves around black men. Examples being the 15th Amendment expanding suffrage to only men, and recent focus on police brutality excludes black women from the discussion, as we saw in Crenshaw's talk about intersectionality and its focus on Say Her Name. Crenshaw says that violence against women of color is affected by the intersection of racism and sexism and the failures of both the feminist and anti-racist movements to seriously address this issue. So what are solutions to this dangerous problem? Reform of police departments and require specific sensitivity training to officers. Develop national plans and policies to address violence against women. Advocate to make violence against women unacceptable. Make this violence a public health problem through activism. Provide referral and support to women and children in these situations to prevent reoccurrence of violence. Build more safe houses and shelters. Intervention in communities, and finally, which is the most important of them all, is better educate our youth to promote a more promising, violent-free future. Women'sHealth.gov provides various confidential resources for victims of violence, sexual violence, and domestic abuse. I encourage you all to pass this information on to anyone you know who may be a victim. Furthermore, gender depression and its intersection with discrimination based on race has its place in history and in today. In expanding our knowledge of intersectionality, we will be better equipped to provide multidimensional solutions to social injustices for groups that are often disregarded, and as Professor Crenshaw states, if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. Please don't let that happen.